The Force is old and full of shadows.
The Death Star hummed, not with malice, not with the grinding industrial fury one might expect of a weapon built to swallow suns. It hummed the way ancient things hum, a low, resonant vibration that lived in the bones rather than the ears, the sound of something vast and patient that had been waiting a very long time to be used. Obi-Wan Kenobi stood at the end of a corridor and looked at Darth Vader, and he was not afraid. That was the thing he noticed first, the absence of fear, clean and complete, like a room emptied of furniture. 40 years of living had burned the fear away, or perhaps only clarified it, refined it down to something so small and so pure, it no longer had the mass to anchor him to the floor. He felt it distantly, the way a man feels weather changing in an old injury. It was there. It simply did not matter. Vader advanced. The black armor absorbed the corridor's light. The red blade drew a line between them like a wound in the air itself. Obi-Wan raised his own blade, blue, steady, untroubled, and let everything go. He did not think about Anakin, not here, not now. That grief had its place, but this moment was not it. He thought instead about what he had learned in 20 years of desert silence, that the Force did not require him to be young, or strong, or unbroken. It only required him to be present, fully, completely, without remainder. Vader's strike came low and fast. Obi-Wan moved aside, not backward, aside, a quarter step, the blade passing close enough to warm his cheek. "When I left you, I was but the learner," he said. His voice surprised him, old and calm and almost kind. "Now, I am the master." Vader said nothing. He rarely did, in the end. Obi-Wan lowered his blade. The decision arrived not as thought, but as bone knowledge, the certainty of something already finished. He felt the Force around him the way a man feels sunlight, not grasped, only received. And in that reception, something opened, a door in the structure of things that had always existed, that he had simply finally stopped being too alive to walk through. He closed his eyes. He felt the blow before it landed. He did not step back. Then darkness. Not the darkness of sleep or grief or fear, but the darkness of open water, of depth without boundary, of a silence so complete it circled back to sound, no pain, no ending. For one suspended and unmeasurable instant, everything at once, the smell of ozone hit him like a physical blow. He gasped. The sound tore out of him before he could stop it, raw, involuntary, the body's ancient refusal to accept stillness. His knees struck durasteel plating and he caught himself on one hand, palm flat against the floor, fingers spread, the metal cold and real and absolutely undeniably present. A crimson ray shield pulsed 5 meters ahead. Beyond it, muffled and distorted, the clash of lightsabers, a sound he knew the way he knew his own heartbeat, a sound he had grown up falling asleep to in training halls and woken to in battlefields across 100 worlds. The hum and crack of it filtered through the energy barrier like something heard underwater. Obi-Wan pressed his free hand over his mouth and breathed. 25 years old. The thought arrived with the force of a physical impact. He was 25 years old. He could feel it, the body's absurd, embarrassing vitality pressing at him from every direction, the joints that didn't ache, the lungs that expanded without effort, the reflexes coiled and ready at the surface of every muscle. His mind reached for the familiar geography of age and found instead this unasked-for youth, this body that did not yet know what was coming. He remembered everything, not as flashes or impressions, everything, the full, unedited weight of every year, between this moment and that corridor on the Death Star, more than 3 decades of living compressed into the body of a man who hadn't lived them yet. He remembered Qui-Gon's pyre. He remembered Anakin at 9 years old, looking up at him with those enormous, wondering eyes. He remembered every moment he had failed, every word left unsaid, every time the code had seemed more important than the man standing in front of him. He remembered Mustafar. He did not allow himself to stay in Mustafar. On the other side of the ray shield, he heard Qui-Gon cry out. The sound moved through him like a blade. He knew that cry. He had carried it for 30 years, had heard it in dreams across his exile, had spent 2 decades in Tatooine's silence, learning, slowly, to hold it without being destroyed by it. He knew what it meant. He knew exactly what was happening on the other side of that wall of crimson light, and he knew, with the specific, terrible clarity of a man who has seen this moment from every angle, that he could not stop it. He could not save Qui-Gon. He could only choose who he was in the seconds he had left. The ray shield cycled. The crimson light dropped. Where a 25-year-old Padawan would have charged, screaming, furious, grief already becoming aggression, already becoming the first link in a chain he would spend years trying to break, old Ben walked. Long, measured strides, blade raised not in threat but in readiness, the way a man raises an umbrella before the rain begins rather than after. Sorsu, pure Sorasu, the form he had spent a lifetime mastering, the form built not for killing but for surviving, for outlasting, for making violence unprofitable. He settled into it the way water settles into a low place, without effort, without announcement. Maul turned. The Zabrak was a striking creature. Old Ben had almost forgotten. The red and black tattoos, the horns, the eyes that held no color a living thing's eyes should hold. He moved the way predators move, with the boneless, coiled efficiency of something that had never once in its life doubted it was the most dangerous animal in any given room. Both blades of his saber staff burned in the generator complex's shadow, and when he saw the Padawan walking toward him without fury, something crossed his face that old Ben recognized after a moment's confusion. "Good. The Master is finished," Maul said. His voice carried the quality of someone who had never learned to modulate contempt. "Face me, Padawan, while you still have the will for it." Old Ben said nothing. He closed the distance, at a steady walk, and settled into his guard. Maul attacked. He was extraordinary. Old Ben felt that first. Not fear, but recognition, the deep professional acknowledgement of someone watching a virtuoso at work. The strikes came in combinations that should have been impossible for any bipedal creature, each one flowing from the last without pause or reset. The saber staff a wheel of red that left no angle unguarded and no space uncontested. Old Ben deflected, redirected, stepped aside, let the energy pass. He did not counter, he did not press. He gave Maul nothing, no aggression to exploit, no anger to mirror back, no fear to feed on. He simply declined to be where the blade was. Again and again, with the unhurried patience of a man who has already seen how this ends. Maul's combinations grew faster. Old Ben's footwork grew smaller. "Fight me," Maul snarled. The word came out frayed at the edges, contempt curdling towards something uglier. "I am," Old Ben said. 3 more exchanges. Maul, adjusting, pressed harder. A sweeping low cut that would have taken a younger fighter's legs, redirected. A thrusting high combination that would have opened the throat of anyone who flinched, sidestepped. A desperate, furious spinning strike that carried all of Maul's considerable weight and momentum behind it, designed to break through any guard by sheer kinetic force. Old Ben let it pass a half-inch from his shoulder, stepped inside the arc, and struck once. Precise, economic, the flat of his blade against the saber staff's hilt. Not a killing blow, a breaking one. And the weapon spun from Maul's grip and clattered against the generator housing. The force closed around the Zabrak like a fist. Maul hit the floor. He struggled. Old Ben could feel him fighting it. The raw, furious power of a warrior who did not understand why his body had stopped obeying him, who had never in his life been held rather than killed. He thrashed against telekinetic bonds he could not see and could not break, his eyes finding old Ben's with an expression that had no name because nothing in his training had ever prepared him for this specific situation. A Jedi who had him at his mercy and wasn't using it. "You'll be taken in," Old Ben said, quietly. "You'll be questioned. You'll be held." A pause. "I'm sorry it won't be more comfortable." He turned away from Maul's rage and walked toward the sound of labored breathing. Qui-Gon Jinn lay on his back on the generator complex floor, and the wound in his torso was the wound old Ben had memorized without meaning to, across 20 years of remembering. He lowered himself to his knees beside his master, beside this man who had believed in him before he had believed in himself, this man whose death had made him who he was and whose face he had not seen in 2 decades. And old Ben took his hand and held it, and did not try to hold back what he felt. "Master," he said. Qui-Gon's eyes found his. The surprise in them was unmistakable, the same surprise old Ben understood now that he had seen on Yoda's face many years later, when the old master had finally stopped asking and simply trusted. Something in Obi-Wan was different. Qui-Gon felt it too, in the end. The generator complex was quiet, except for the sound of the two of them breathing, and the distant hum of a city that didn't know what it had nearly lost, and the soft crackle of a ray shield that no longer needed to hold anything back. Qui-Gon Jinn was not afraid of dying. Old Ben had known that about him once. In an abstract, intellectual way, the way a student knows a theorem before he has ever needed to use it. He knew it differently now. He could feel it in the quality of Qui-Gon's stillness, the way his breath came slow and considered rather than ragged and desperate. Each inhale a choice rather than a reflex. A man making peace with arithmetic. The numbers didn't add up to survival, and Qui-Gon Jinn had always been too honest to argue with numbers. "You're not afraid," Qui-Gon said. His voice was thin but clear. "I'm terrified," Old Ben said. "I've just learned what to do with it." Qui-Gon studied him. The eyes that had always seen further than most were still doing their work even now, reading him the way they had always read him, patient and unhurried, finding the things Obi-Wan had never quite managed to hide. Qui-Gon had always been able to see past whatever face Obi-Wan was wearing. Old Ben had forgotten that. The reminder hit him somewhere between the sternum and the spine. "There is something different in you," Qui-Gon said. Not an accusation, offered the way Qui-Gon offered everything, without judgment, without demand, with only the quiet expectation of honesty. Old Ben looked at him for a long moment. The thing he wanted to say was enormous and impossible, and would have taken hours and still perhaps not landed right. And Qui-Gon had minutes, not hours. So he chose the true thing beneath the impossible thing. "I've had a long time to think," he said, "about what I should have done differently." Something moved in Qui-Gon's expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. The look of a man who has just had a suspicion confirmed that he did not entirely know he had. His hand tightened slightly around Old Ben's. "The boy," Qui-Gon said. "Yes, you'll train him." Old Ben did not answer immediately. He looked down at their joined hands, Qui-Gon's broad and calloused, his own still absurdly young, the skin unlined, unmarked by the desert years that had not happened yet. He thought about a 9-year-old boy somewhere in this palace, frightened and trying not to show it, carrying inside himself the architecture of two people who did not yet exist. Luke's stubbornness, Leia's fire. "I'll train him," he said, "but not the way I would have." Qui-Gon's breath caught, not in pain, or not only in pain. "Tell me." "I was going to be his master the way you were mine," Old Ben said, "the way the Order taught us both to be, capable, present, but always at arm's length, always careful not to let him see that it mattered." He stopped, pressed on. "He needed a father, and I gave him a Jedi Knight. I didn't understand then that those weren't the same thing." The generator complex breathed around them. Somewhere above, Naboo's sky was going gold with late afternoon light. "He'll be extraordinary," Old Ben continued, and the word came out soft, almost private, the word of a man describing something he has already seen. He already is. He's 9 years old, and he can feel the living things inside the stars. He's going to be the finest Jedi of his generation. A pause. "But that's not why I'm going to do it right this time." "Why then?" Old Ben looked at his master's face. "Because he's going to be mine," he said simply, "and I'm going to be his, and I should have understood that from the beginning." Qui-Gon closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something in them had settled. The last of whatever tension had been holding the space between living and letting go. His grip on Old Ben's hand did not loosen. It shifted, became something less like holding on and more like offering. "You were always my finest student," Qui-Gon said, "even when you were certain you weren't." Old Ben did not trust his voice. He nodded. "The living force," Qui-Gon said. His voice was dropping now, the words requiring more effort than they had moments ago. "Be a student of it, Obi-Wan. Not just the code, the living things. They'll teach you what the archive cannot." "I know," Old Ben said. 20 years of Tatooine dawn light, of watching moisture evaporate from rock, of following small desert wrens with his eyes and feeling, faintly but consistently, their aliveness registering against the edge of his perception. "I already know." Qui-Gon's breathing changed. Old Ben did not look away. He held the hand and he stayed present, fully present, without flinching. This man who had taught him that the Force was not a doctrine but a relationship, that living things mattered more than systems, that an open hand received more than a closed one. He stayed until the breathing stopped. He stayed a moment after. Then he bowed his head and let himself feel it. Not the grief of a young Padawan losing his anchor, but the grief of an old man saying a second goodbye to someone he had loved for a very long time. They were different griefs. The first had nearly broken him. The second moved through him like weather, painful and clean, the kind of sorrow that leaves the ground more fertile afterward. He wept quietly, without performance, without shame. Anakin found him there 20 minutes later. The boy moved the way he always moved, with that combination of physical boldness and social uncertainty that old Ben had once found difficult and now recognized as the exact signature of a child who had learned confidence from the outside, and rather than the inside out. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, his face cycling through shock and grief and an uncertainty about what was appropriate that was painfully familiar. He was small. Old Ben had forgotten how small he was at 9. The memory of Anakin at 19, at 22, at the height of the wars, that version of him, all barely contained force and frustrated intensity, had overlaid this one so thoroughly that the reality of him was almost startling. A child's face, a child's hands, the force around him like a bonfire around a match. Old Ben rose to his feet. He crossed the distance between them and did something he had not done, in any iteration of this meeting, in the life he remembered. He knelt, not deferentially, not as a performance of humility. He knelt so that his eyes were level with the boy's eyes, so that Anakin did not have to look up at him, so that the first thing this child saw when he looked at the man who was going to shape him was not height or authority or the particular remote dignity that Jedi Masters wore like a second robe, but a face, just a face, at his level, looking back at him. Anakin's chin did the thing it did when he was trying not to cry. The muscle jumped twice, was controlled, jumped again. "He's gone," Anakin said. Not a question. Yes. Did he? Was it? He wasn't afraid, old Ben said. He was at peace. He chose it. The chin. Again, old Ben put his hand on the boy's shoulder. He felt Anakin go very still under the contact. The stillness of a creature not accustomed to being touched without reason, cataloging the gesture, trying to determine what it meant. Old Ben left his hand there and waited. "Are you Obi-Wan?" Anakin asked. "He talked about you." "He talked about you too," old Ben said. "More than you'd think." Something shifted in the boy's face, small and careful, the first unclenching of something that had been held tight for a long time. "He did? He said you were extraordinary," old Ben said. He was right. I've seen enough to know. Anakin looked at him with the specific searching look of a child who has been disappointed by adults enough times to fact-check compliments. His eyes moved across old Ben's face looking for the seam, the place where the performance joined the reality. He didn't find one, because there wasn't one. "I'm going to train you," old Ben said, "if you'll have me. The council, leave the council to me." Anakin absorbed this. Some calculation ran behind his eyes, quick and intricate. The same processing power that could read a podracer's engine by sound and correct it mid-race now applied to the question of whether this man could be trusted. Old Ben waded through it. He had learned to wait. "Okay," Anakin said finally. Small word. It carried the weight of everything. Old Ben stood. He did not remove his hand from the boy's shoulder. That evening, on the lawn below the Theed Palace, the pyre burned gold against a violet sky. Old Ben stood beside Anakin and felt the heat of it on his face, and listened to the Naboo morning songs drift up into the dark in languages he half remembered. Around them, the queen and her handmaidens stood in quiet ceremony. The palace lights were dim. The city, for once, was still. He did not look at the fire. He looked at Anakin, who was looking at the fire with the focused, unblinking attention of someone memorizing a thing they know they will need to carry for a long time. Old Ben spoke quietly, low enough that only the night and the Force could hear him. "I'll do it right this time," the fire answered with a long, slow breath of amber light. Anakin did not ask what he meant. Some part of him, the part that lived below language, in the register where the Force moved and children knew things without knowing how they knew them, heard it anyway. He moved, slightly, closer. Old Ben let him. The Jedi Temple at dawn. The 5 spires rose above Coruscant's endless cityscape, like fingers pressed together in meditation, ancient and unhurried above the city's perpetual noise. From the outside, the temple looked exactly as it always had, immovable, certain, The physical argument that some things in the galaxy did not change regardless of what the Senate decided, or the markets did, or the outer systems suffered. Inside, in the corridors that smelled of aged stone and lamp oil, and the particular stillness that accumulated in places where people had been quiet for a very long time, Obi-Wan Kenobi walked with a 9-year-old boy at his side and felt, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the specific weight of these halls pressing down on him. He had missed it. That surprised him. He had thought in the desert years that what he missed was the Order's purpose. The sense of being useful pointed at something larger than himself. He understood now, walking these corridors again, that what he had actually missed was simpler and harder to name. The smell of it, the quality of the silence, the way the Force pooled in old places like water in stone hollows. Anakin walked beside him and said nothing. He had been saying nothing with great deliberateness since they left the transport, taking everything in with those wide, cataloging eyes, storing it running calculations old Ben could almost hear. The boy's presence in the Force was extraordinary, even at rest. Not wild exactly, enormous. The way a river in full flood is not wild, but simply larger than the banks anyone built for it. "They're going to say I'm too old," Anakin said. Old Ben glanced at him. "Yes, and too angry. They'll say you have too much fear. It's their preferred framing." Anakin looked up at him, with an expression mixing offense and uncertainty in roughly equal measure. "Do I? You're 9 years old and you've been enslaved your entire life, and you've just watched the only adult who believed in you die in front of you," Old Ben said. "Of course you're afraid. Anyone who wasn't afraid after all of that would concern me considerably more." Anakin processed this, stored it, filed it somewhere important, Old Ben suspected. The same place he filed anything that contradicted what he had been told to expect. "What are you going to tell them?" Anakin asked. "The truth," Old Ben said, at some length. The council chamber at the temple's peak held 12 seats, arranged in a circle, and in the middle of the morning light that fell through the high windows and painted everything gold and shadow, it looked exactly as Old Ben remembered it, beautiful, serious, and faintly pleased with itself. He walked into it with Anakin at his shoulder, and felt 12 sets of Jedi perception converge on them both, with the focused attention of people who made their living reading the Force, and knew immediately that something in this room was different from what they had expected. Yoda's eyes found him first. They always did. "Knight Kenobi," Mace Windu said. He sat with the particular stillness of a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that his presence alone constituted a kind of pressure. "We were sorry to hear of Master Jin's passing." He was, "Thank you, Master Windu," Old Ben said, gently, not dismissively. He was not here to be rude. "I'd like to speak to the matter of Anakin's training if the council is willing." The 12 seats exchanged the particular silence of people communicating without words. "Willing we are," Yoda said. "Decided the matter is not." "No," Old Ben agreed. "It isn't. That's why I'm here." He looked at Anakin once, briefly, a look that said stay, and be still, and trust me, and then he looked at the council and let them see whatever it was they could see in him now. He had wondered, on the journey from Naboo, what they would make of it, Yoda in particular. The old master had always been able to feel the texture of a person's relationship with the Force, the way a craftsman felt the grain of wood, not by looking at it, but by pressing. "Bring the boy forward," Mace said. Anakin stepped forward. He stood in the center of the chamber with his chin up and his hands very still at his sides, performing composure with the practiced determination of someone who had learned early that any display of feeling was a liability. Old Ben watched the council watch him and felt the familiar ache of it. 12 of the wisest people in the galaxy looking at a 9-year-old child and seeing, before anything else, the things that frightened them. The questions came, patient, methodical, the Order's standard assessment stripped of warmth by design rather than malice. "What do you feel right now? Describe what you see in your mind. Name the things you are afraid of." Anakin answered each one with the careful precision of someone navigating a minefield they cannot see. And with each answer, Old Ben saw the council's collective expression settle incrementally toward the conclusion they had already drawn before the boy walked in. Yoda said, when the questions were done. His eyes had not left Anakin's face. "Much fear in you, young one." "Yes," Anakin said. He did not pretend otherwise. Old Ben noted this, quietly. His mother, Ki-Adi-Mundi, said, He still grieves the separation. He arrived 3 days ago, Old Ben said. His mother is alive and well on Tatooine. Grief at separation seems rather appropriate, wouldn't the council agree? A small silence. The attachment itself is the concern, Mace said. His voice was not unkind. That was the most honest thing Old Ben could say about Mace Windu. He was never unkind, even when he was wrong. A Jedi must be able to release what he fears to lose, Old Ben said. Yes, I know the teaching. I was raised on it. He paused. Let that land. I've also had the opportunity to reflect, at length, on what happens when it's applied as a categorical prohibition rather than a graduated discipline. I'd like to share my perspective. The chamber went quiet in a different way. Mace studied him. You're 25 years old, Knight Kenobi. I'm aware of what I look like, Old Ben said. Yoda had not spoken. He was watching Old Ben with an expression that had moved over the course of the last several minutes, from assessment to something more careful and less nameable. His ears were slightly raised. Old Ben had spent enough time with Yoda across enough years to know what that meant. The old master was not reading the argument. He was reading the person making it. Old Ben looked at him directly. Then he looked back at the council. You fear his fear, he said. I understand why. The formulation is elegant, and it's not wrong. Fear does lead to anger to suffering. The chain is real, and I've seen it completed. But the lesson you've drawn from it is incomplete. He let that sit for a moment. Fear tended is not fear that festers. It's the fear you name, examine, and refuse to be ashamed of that loses its grip. It's the fear you leave in the dark that turns. Suppression is not the teaching, Mace began. It is the culture, Old Ben said. Firm, unequivocal, not angry, and the absence of anger in the delivery of something this direct seemed to unsettle the room more than anger would have. There is a difference between the code and the culture that has grown up around it. The code asks Jedi to release their fear. The culture we have built asks Jedi to pretend it doesn't exist. That is not the same instruction, and the results are not the same. He paused. This boy is afraid. He should be. His circumstances have been extraordinary in the wrong directions. What he needs is not to be told his fear is disqualifying. He needs to be taught what to do with it. He needs someone who will sit with him in the dark and help him learn to look at it clearly. Old Ben kept his voice level. I am volunteering to be that person. I'm asking the council to let me. Yoda made a small sound, not a word, more like a punctuation mark, the sound of a very old mind arriving at something it needed a moment to hold. Trained you well, Qui-Gon did, Yoda said quietly. It was not quite the thing Old Ben had expected him to say. He taught me to pay attention, Old Ben said. I've been paying attention ever since. Another silence. This one had a different texture. The council conferred without speaking, the way only people who had worked together for decades could confer. A series of glances, small shifts in posture, the Force carrying the shape of opinions without the content of words. Mace looked at Old Ben. Something had changed in his expression. Not agreement, precisely, the specific adjustment a person makes when they have encountered an argument they cannot immediately dismantle and are deciding whether that means the argument is right. The boy will train with you, Mace said. On your terms, on your responsibility. Accepted, Old Ben said immediately. Your responsibility this is, Yoda added. His eyes had not left Old Ben's face. Chosen a different path than I would choose, you have. Watch the results, I will. I hope you do, Old Ben said, and meant it. They walked out of the council chamber together, into a corridor of gold morning light. Anakin's stride had changed. Some weight lifted, replaced by something looser and less careful. He glanced up at Old Ben with an expression compounded of relief and a very young kind of wonder. You argued with the council, he said. I disagreed with the council, Old Ben said. There's a distinction. Old Ben considered, arguing is about winning. Disagreeing is about being honest. He glanced down at the boy. The council is worth being honest with. That's different from always doing what they say. Anakin walked with this for several steps. Are you always like this? Old Ben almost smiled. Not always, he said. I had to learn it. They walked on together, the old man in a young man's body and the boy who would become the father of the future, moving deeper into the temple and into the long, unwritten work of becoming what they needed to be for each other. Behind them, in the council chamber, Yoda sat alone for a long moment after the others had dispersed. He pressed his fingers together. He closed his eyes. Something in that Jedi night, something behind the words, beneath the argument, older than the face, had pressed against Yoda's perception the way a forgotten word presses against the edge of memory. He could not name it. He had tried, across the last hour, and each attempt had slipped past him like water past cupped hands. He did not press further. He had learned across 900 years that the Force occasionally produced things that did not require names, that some mysteries were not puzzles to be solved, but gifts to be received. He chose to receive it. Tatooine from the air looked exactly like a wound. Old Ben watched it through the transport's viewport as they descended. The ochre expanse of it, the way the twin suns hammered the surface into something that had given up on color, the dust that hung perpetually in the lower atmosphere like the planet was always in the process of erasing itself. He had spent 20 years on this rock. He knew every register of its light, every season of its particular cruelty, the way the nights went cold with a swiftness that still surprised him even now in memory. He had not expected it to feel like coming home. Beside him, Anakin had his face pressed to the viewport with the specific, helpless intensity of someone who has been trying not to want something for a very long time, and has run out of the energy to keep not wanting it. "She's in Mos Espa," Anakin said. Not a question. He had asked 3 times already on 3 separate legs of the journey, and Old Ben had answered all 3 times without comment. "She is," Old Ben said, "and she doesn't know we're coming." "Watto doesn't know we're coming either," Old Ben said. "That part is rather important." Mos Espa in the midday heat was an assault delivered through every sense simultaneously. The smell of it hit first, engine oil and roasting meat, and the particular mineral sharpness of dust that had been baking since before the Republic was young. Then the noise. A dozen languages layered over each other in the market rows. The mechanical complaint of aging machinery. The sound of a populated place that had never once in its history been asked to be comfortable. Old Ben moved through it with the unhurried ease of a man who had walked these streets in a different life, in different robes, with a different face. He knew which vendor left his power cells unattended on the corner of the 3rd row. He knew which alley ran behind Watto's shop and where the shadow fell in the afternoon. He knew, most importantly, that Watto would be in his back lot at this hour, reviewing the parts manifest he kept on a battered data pad, nursing his 3rd cup of something fermented, already in the mood to believe that any transaction he initiated was a transaction he controlled. He left Anakin at the market entrance with strict instructions and a look that communicated, without ambiguity, that the instructions were not optional. Anakin sat down on a crate and radiated obedience with the effortful concentration of someone performing a task they find genuinely difficult. Watto was exactly where Old Ben knew he would be. The Toydarian hovered at eye level over his datapad, wings moving in the small, rapid flutter that meant he was irritated at something. Inventory discrepancy, probably. Or a parts order that hadn't arrived. He looked up when Old Ben's shadow fell across the manifest, and his expression arranged itself into the professional warmth of a merchant who had learned to lead with affability. A Jedi, eh? Watto's accent thickened when he was performing. "We don't see many Jedi in Mos Espa. What can Watto do for you, eh?" "I'm looking for parts," Old Ben said pleasantly. "Converters, mostly. And I heard you were the man to speak to about an interesting wager." Watto's wings beat faster. That, too, was a tell. Enthusiasm he was trying to metabolize into calm before it showed too clearly. "Watto always enjoys a good wager. Who told you this?" "A trader named Peloon. He spoke very highly of your instincts." This was a fabrication, but it was a fabrication built on a real foundation. Watto's pride in his own gambling acumen was the load-bearing wall of his entire personality. And a compliment delivered through a named third party landed differently than one delivered face-to-face. Old Ben watched the Toydarian absorb it, saw the small preening adjustment in his posture. "Peloon, eh? Smart man." Watto set down his datapad. What kind of wager? Old Ben had spent the 3-week journey from Coruscant reconstructing everything he knew about Tatooine's economic landscape from the years he had observed it in his exile. He knew which pod races ran on which circuits. He knew which mechanic had recently purchased a stolen stabilizer array and would need to offload it quietly within the next fortnight. He knew, specifically, that a Rhodian trader had arrived in Mos Espa the previous week, with a cargo of hyperdrive components that the local brokers had collectively undervalued by a margin significant enough to matter. He laid it out for Watto in broad strokes, not as a tip, never as a tip, but as a casual observation, the kind of thing a well-traveled Jedi might have overheard in the right spaceport. He watched Watto's eyes do the calculation, watched the moment the Toydarian decided the idea was his own, and said nothing to correct this impression. Hyperdrive components, Watto mused, already somewhere else in his head. Probably nothing, Old Ben said. I may have misheard. No. Watto has an ear for these things. He tapped the side of his head. You said, converters. Come, I have what you need. The negotiation for Shmi took 11 minutes. Old Ben had expected it to take longer, but Watto's mood, elevated by the opportunity, expansive, inclined toward generosity because he was already counting a profit that hadn't materialized yet, made him more tractable than his baseline. Old Ben mentioned, as an afterthought, that he was looking for domestic staff for a household on Alderaan. Reliable, trustworthy. Someone accustomed to managing complex environments. He mentioned the figure he was prepared to pay. Watto named a counter. Old Ben accepted it without negotiating down. He had learned, across a long life, that the moment you haggle over a person's freedom is the moment you have already lost something that doesn't come back. The slave Shmi, Old Ben said. I'll need the release papers filed with the local registry. Watto waved a hand. He was already thinking about hyperdrive components. Yes. She's a good worker, you understand. Watto is practically doing you a favor. Ha! Watto always makes the smart deal. The papers took 30 minutes to process. Old Ben waited in the shade of the shop's awning and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill that had taken him 15 of his 20 desert years to learn properly. Shmi Skywalker came out of the back of the shop, drying her hands on a cloth, and she stopped when she saw the Jedi, and something moved across her face before she controlled it. Hope and suspicion in the same instant, the expression of a person who has learned to be careful about what they let themselves want. I don't understand, she said. Her voice was quiet and steady and carried, underneath the steadiness, years of practice at not breaking. Your son asked me to find you, Old Ben said. This was not precisely true in the timeline, but it was true in every way that mattered. You're free, Shmi. The papers are filed. She looked at the documents in his hand. She did not take them immediately. She looked at them the way a person looks at something they have wanted for so long that the wanting has become structural, part of the architecture of how they move through the world, and the sudden prospect of not needing it anymore requires a moment of adjustment. Then she took them. Old Ben walked her out of the shop, past Watto, who waved cheerfully without looking up from his datapad, into the hammer of the Tatooine afternoon. Anakin was still on his crate. He saw them before they reached him, saw his mother before he understood what he was seeing. And he came off the crate so fast he nearly fell, catching himself and stopping 3 feet away from her with an expression Old Ben had no word for. It was too many things at once, joy and disbelief, and the specific, terrible vulnerability of someone who has armored themselves completely and suddenly has no use for the armor. She's free, he said, looking at Old Ben, not yet able to look at her directly. Really free? No one owns your mother, Old Ben said. Not anymore, not ever again. Anakin looked at his mother. Shmi crossed the remaining distance and put her arms around her son. And Anakin, 9 years old, the most powerful, Force-sensitive in living memory, future knight and husband and father, buried his face against her shoulder and made no sound at all. Old Ben looked away. He gave them the moment without witness, turning his face toward the twin suns beating down on Mos Espa's dusty streets, feeling the warmth of it against skin that was still, somehow, young. The ground beneath Anakin Skywalker's future had just shifted by several degrees. What grew on it from here would grow differently, rooted in something the original architecture had never included. The crack that darkness had spent a decade preparing to widen no longer existed. It had simply been filled. Pla-la Coruscant moved at the speed of ambition. That was the thing about the capital. It never paused, never dimmed completely, never allowed the particular quality of stillness that let a person hear themselves think. Even in the deep hours of the night, the sky lanes hummed with traffic, and the Senate district blazed, and the whole planet city churned forward on the fuel of its own importance. Old Ben had lived here for years, once, and had not noticed the noise until Tatooine taught him what quiet actually was. He noticed it now, he let it pass through him, and paid it no particular mind. What he paid mind to was Anakin, always Anakin, the constant low-frequency awareness of the boy that had become, over 4 years of training, as natural as breathing. He knew where Anakin was in a building the way he knew where his own hands were in the dark. Not surveillance, not vigilance in the anxious sense, simply the attunement of two people who had spent enough time together that the force between them had worn a groove. Anakin was in the training cell at this hour, working on his Form V sequences with the focused, slightly obsessive energy he brought to anything mechanical. He would be there for another hour, and then he would eat too fast and argue with a senior Padawan about something aeronautical, and then he would sleep soundly and completely, the sleep of a person whose conscience was, on balance, clear. Old Ben sat at his desk in the quarters they shared and reviewed a document from Leia Organa's office, confirmation that Shmi had settled well on Alderaan, that she had found work she enjoyed, that the identity papers were clean and complete. He read it twice, then filed it where no one would think to look, and sat for a moment in the quiet of the room. 4 years. In 4 years, Anakin had grown into something that still occasionally stopped old Ben mid-thought. Not with surprise, exactly, but with the specific quality of recognition that comes from knowing how a story ends and watching it choose differently anyway. He was 13 now, tall for his age, possessed of a mechanical intuition that bordered on telepathic, and a piloting instinct that had no border at all. He was also, quietly and persistently, one of the warmest people old Ben had encountered in any version of his life. He made friends without trying. He remembered birthdays. He had organized, entirely on his own initiative, a study group for 4 younger Padawans who were struggling with their lightsaber foundations, and ran it with the patient, specific enthusiasm of someone who had once been told he was too old to learn, and had taken it as a personal affront to prove wrong. He was not without difficulty. He felt everything at amplified volume, joy and frustration and impatience all running hot, requiring the daily practice of the techniques old Ben had taught him. He was arrogant about machines and occasionally about people. He would argue a point past the moment it was worth arguing, and circle back to it an hour later. He was, in short, exactly himself, uncontained and unashamed and genuinely, specifically himself, in a way that the boy old Ben had failed the first time around, had never quite been permitted to be. This was the shield. Old Ben had never called it that aloud, but it was the word he used in his own mind. The shield against the dark, constructed not from policy or prohibition, but from the accumulated weight of 4 years of daily choices. Every morning Anakin woke up in a life where he was known. Every question he had not been supposed to ask, under the old way of things, had been asked and answered. Every fear he might have been trained to conceal had been examined in the open air, until it lost the density that darkness gives things. There was no vacuum in him for manipulation to fill. The Chancellor's invitation arrived in the middle of an ordinary working week, as such things tended to do. Old Ben had been anticipating this one for 3 months, running small calculations about timing and approach. When the formal calligraphed note appeared requesting that Anakin join the Chancellor for a private opera viewing, he read it twice, and then took it to Anakin and watched the boy's face. "Opera," Anakin said, with the expression of someone who has been asked to eat something they've never encountered before, and is prepared to be polite about it. "The Chancellor is fond of Anakin Skywalker," old Ben said, mildly. "He takes an interest." Anakin looked at him with the specific sideways look he deployed when he suspected old Ben was being more careful with words than usual. 4 years had made him precise about that. "You don't like him." "I haven't said that." "You haven't not said it, either." Old Ben looked at his Padawan for a moment. He had learned across these 4 years that the fastest way to make something interesting to Anakin was to suggest it shouldn't be examined too closely. He chose, instead, the truth in the register Anakin could actually use. "I think the Chancellor is a man who enjoys collecting relationships with people he finds useful," old Ben said. "I think he's very skilled at making those people feel uniquely understood. And I think that skill deserves, not suspicion, exactly, attention." Anakin turned this over. "You're saying he's performing?" "I'm saying most powerful people perform, and the wise ones can't always be distinguished from the genuine ones by the performance alone." Old Ben paused. "I'll come with you if that's acceptable." It was not a request precisely, but it wasn't not a request either. The Galaxy's Opera House occupied the high end of the Senate District's entertainment tier, all clean lines and imported marble and the particular aesthetic of a place that wanted to communicate that the people inside it were serious about beauty. Old Ben sat beside Anakin in the Chancellor's private box, and watched Palpatine conduct his performance with the detached professional admiration of someone watching a very skilled technician work. He was extraordinary. Old Ben had known this, and still found the reality of it affecting. The warmth Palpatine generated was not cold or calculated in any way the eye could detect. It seemed to come from genuine interest, genuine curiosity, genuine delight in the young man sitting 2 seats away from him. He leaned slightly toward Anakin when he spoke. He remembered details from previous conversations. He deployed humor with the precision of someone who has studied what makes a specific person laugh. Anakin responded to it. Of course he did. He was 13, and the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic was treating him as an intellectual equal, and that was always going to register. But something else was also registering. Old Ben, watching from the corner of his attention, saw it happen in small increments across the first hour. Anakin's responses becoming slightly more considered, slightly more measured, not shutting down, recalibrating, the way he recalibrated when he was working a mechanical problem that wasn't behaving the way it should. "Don't you find," Palpatine said, during the intermission, turning his attention to Old Ben with the specific warmth of a man including a third party he had not forgotten about, that the Jedi Order can be rather rigid in its expectations of young talent? I often wonder if Anakin's gifts might be constrained by such structures. Old Ben smiled. It was a genuine smile, which was what made it effective. "The Council is flawed," he said pleasantly. "I've told them so myself, at some length, on several occasions." He let that sit for a moment. "I find that most institutions are. The ones worth belonging to are the ones you can criticize from the inside without the walls falling down." Palpatine held his expression perfectly. "You speak rather boldly for a Jedi Knight." "I've found boldness saves time, Chancellor," Old Ben said. A pause, barely measurable. A pause that a less attentive person would not have registered at all. Then Palpatine smiled and turned back to Anakin and said something warm and specific about the performance. Old Ben watched the stage. He did not watch Palpatine in an obvious way for the rest of the evening. He did not need to. He had done the thing that needed doing, occupied the ground before anything could be planted in it, offered honest criticism of the Order that left nothing for a darker version to add, made Anakin's relationship with him visible and proximate, and not a vacuum but a presence. After, walking back to the temple through the Coruscant night, Anakin was quiet for a long time. "He's very good at making you feel like the most interesting person in the room," Anakin said eventually. "Yes," Old Ben said, "he is." Another silence. Around them, the city moved and blazed and churned. "It's a bit much, though," Anakin said. "Isn't it? A bit, I don't know, arranged." Old Ben said nothing. He did not need to. In a private office in the Senate district, Palpatine sat alone after his guests had gone, and was still for a long time. The opera program lay open on his desk, unread. His hands were folded. His expression, with no audience to perform for, had gone somewhere else entirely. Somewhere flat and cold and very, very old. Something in Obi-Wan Kenobi was not what it appeared to be. Every read he had made on young, idealistic Jedi Knights across 60 years of patient, meticulous study simply did not apply. The man had agreed with him about the Council's rigidity, and somehow given him absolutely nothing. He had brought the boy to the opera, and somehow made the boy's presence feel protected rather than accessible. He had smiled and been warm, and deflected every probe without appearing to deflect anything at all. Palpatine sat with this for a long time. The first campaign had failed. He could admit that now, in the privacy of this room, to no one. He would need a different approach entirely. Kamino did not appear on the Jedi Archives map. That was the first thing. The absence, the deliberate erasure of a planet from a record that had stood for 10,000 years without a gap. Old Ben had pulled the archive file 3 times across 6 months, each time confirming what he already knew. The star system existed. The gravitational data of surrounding systems proved it existed. And someone with deep access to Jedi records had removed the entry with enough care that the removal itself left no obvious seam. He had not reported this to the Council. That decision had cost him several nights of sleep, which he had spent staring at the ceiling of his quarters, listening to Anakin breathe steadily in the next room, and working through the justification with the methodical honesty he owed himself. The Council would deliberate. The Council would form a committee. The Council would request access to Kamino through official channels that Tyrannus, Dooku, Count Dooku, The Jedi Master who had trained Qui-Gon, who had trained him, the man old Ben still could not think about without a specific, complicated grief, would hear about before the committee had finished its first session. He had time enough to act, but not to hesitate. He went to see Dexter Jetster instead. Dex's diner occupied a corner of Cocoa Town that had apparently decided at some point in the distant past that cleanliness was an aspiration rather than a standard, and had made its peace with that decision. The smell hit old Ben at the door. Fry oil and cafe, and something involving Nerf meat that had been cooking since early morning. And he stood in the entrance for a moment and let it settle over him like something familiar. He had eaten here many times, once, in a life that hadn't happened yet for anyone but him. Dex was behind the counter, doing something to a grill that required more physical commitment than the grill seemed to think was strictly necessary. He was a large creature, 4 arms, a face that had been on the wrong end of enough opinions to develop considerable character, and when he looked up and saw old Ben, something warm and sharp moved through his expression. "Obi-Wan Kenobi," he said, the way a man says the name of someone he hasn't seen in too long, and is genuinely pleased to see now. "You look terrible. Sit down. I'll get you something." "I don't look terrible," old Ben said, settling onto a counter stool. "I'm 26 years old." "You look 26 years old and terrible," Dex said, pouring caf without being asked. "What's on your mind? And don't tell me nothing, because Jedi don't come to Cocoa Town for the decor." Old Ben wrapped both hands around the cafe mug. He had prepared several versions of this conversation during the journey here, and now that he was in it, he set them all aside and said the true thing simply. "I need a contact," he said. "Someone who works in production logistics on a world the archives don't know about. Someone who doesn't ask questions that will get them killed, and who I can trust not to exist in any record that connects to this conversation." Dex looked at him for a long time with the particular expression of someone who has lived in Cocoa Town long enough that this category of request doesn't surprise them, but who is deciding in real time what they think about the specific person making it. "This is Republic business?" Dex asked. "This is business that will save the Republic a significant amount of suffering," old Ben said. "If it works, and if it doesn't," old Ben drank his caf. "Then it doesn't, and no one ever knows I tried, and the outcome is the same as if I'd done nothing." He set the mug down. "I'm not asking you to take a risk, Dex. I'm asking you to know a person who knows a person." Dex refilled his mug. "There's a Kaminoan," he said, his voice dropping into the register he used when he was giving information rather than conversation. "Works the production oversight side, not the science, the logistics. Name is Taun Se. She's not corrupt. Understand, don't go in thinking she can be bought. But she's not comfortable with everything she's been asked to oversee, and she's smart enough to know what uncomfortable means in the long run." He paused. "I can make an introduction, but Obi-Wan, whatever you're walking into, you walk into it clean. Nothing that comes back to the diner." "Nothing that comes back to the diner," old Ben agreed. Camino from the air was water and sky in proportions that reversed every instinct about which one was supposed to be on the bottom. The landing platform emerged from the cloud cover like a thought becoming solid, white and clean, and utterly indifferent to the storm that perpetually surrounded it, the rain driving sideways across the viewport in long silver curtains. Taun Se met him at the platform's edge. She was tall, pale, unhurried in her movements, with the quality of stillness that came from living on a planet where the weather never stopped, and you either made peace with it or went mad. She looked at him with large, careful eyes, and said nothing for a moment. "You're not here about a military order," she said. "No," old Ben said. "Then you're here about something that concerns me more than a military order would." She turned and walked toward the interior, and he followed. "Come, we'll speak privately." What she showed him, on the third day of careful, tested conversation, was worse than he had remembered it being when he had learned of it the first time around. Not because the function was different. The inhibitor chip, the Order 66 command sequence, buried in the clone neural architecture like a splinter beneath healed skin, but because of the scale, row after row after row of growth chambers, each one containing a life that would be used and then detonated against the people it had been trained to serve. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers who would follow their commanders faithfully, competently, with genuine loyalty, right up until a code word made them killers. He stood in front of the growth chamber displays for a long time, and felt something that was not anger, but was adjacent to it. The cold, focused sensation of a problem being assessed, rather than felt. "The production template," he said. "The chip sequence is specified at the template level before gestation begins." "Yes," Tansy said, quietly. "If the template were modified, if the Order 66 trigger were excised from the baseline specification while leaving the other regulatory functions intact, the resulting clones would show no behavioral deviation from current batches." A silence. "No," Tansy said. "They wouldn't." Old Ben looked at her. "I need to know whether you can do that, and whether you will." She looked back at him, those large, careful eyes reading him with a precision that reminded him slightly of Yoda, reading not the argument, but the person making it. "The batch is already grown," she said. "I cannot undo what's already been done. I know, you understand what that means. Some portion of this army still carries the original sequence." "Yes." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to stop the wound from growing. I can't ask you to undo it entirely. That's beyond either of us. But I can ask you to close it from here forward." She was quiet for a long moment. The rain drove against the platform outside, a constant low roar that lived beneath everything on Camino. "It will take me some weeks," she said finally, "to alter the template without creating a record of the alteration." "Take what time you need," Old Ben said. "Do it right." He flew back to Coruscant alone, through hyperspace, in the particular silence of a ship moving faster than light with no one else aboard. He sat in the co-pilot's seat with nothing to do, and let the silence have him for a while. He had preached, across 4 years of raising Anakin, that concealment was the disease, that love hidden festered, that fear left in the dark turned, that the light was always the better operating environment. He believed this. He believed it, with the full weight of everything he had learned. And he was carrying, now, something he could tell no one. He sat with this for a long time. He did not pretend to himself that it wasn't a contradiction. He did not paper it over with justifications about the greater good, which were available and which he distrusted precisely because they were always available. What he arrived at, finally, was this: a man who preaches honesty and practices it imperfectly is not a hypocrite. He is a person. The standard was not perfection. The standard was the attempt, made deliberately with clear eyes, accepted for exactly what it cost. It cost him something. He acknowledged that to the empty cockpit and the stars outside. Then he set course for Coruscant and went to check on his Padawan. Paula, Naboo in the Lake Country, existed in a register of beauty that Old Ben had never quite learned to be casual about. The water caught the late afternoon light and held it differently than other water held light. Deeper, more considered, as if the lake itself understood what it was doing and had opinions about the effect. The hills rolled back from the shoreline in long green curves, and the villa that Padme's family kept there sat at the water's edge with the particular confidence of a building that had been in the same place for a very long time, and expected to remain. Old Ben sat on the terrace and watched the light change on the water, and waited. He had known this was coming for 8 months. He had watched it accumulate the way you watch weather building on a horizon. The specific quality of attention Anakin paid to Padme when she was in the room. The way she laughed differently around him than around anyone else. The small gravitational adjustments two people make when they are trying very hard not to make them. He had said nothing during those 8 months which had required a discipline he gave himself quiet credit for. He had said nothing because it was not yet time, and because the specific mistake he was here to avoid was not the relationship. It was never the relationship, but the architecture of concealment that would have grown up around it if left to develop in the shadow of the code. That architecture, once built, was the weapon, not the love. He heard them before he saw them. Anakin's voice carrying across the terrace in the particular register he used when he was trying to sound casual about something he felt acutely, and Padme's lower response, measured and dry and affectionate in a way she probably didn't know was visible to anyone paying attention. They came around the corner of the terrace together and stopped when they saw him sitting there. Old Ben looked up from his tea. "Sit down," he said pleasantly. "Both of you." The silence that followed was the silence of two people who have been caught at nothing specific, but who feel, with considerable accuracy, that they have been caught at something. Anakin sat. He was 19 now. The boy Old Ben had knelt to on a Naboo generator floor was somewhere inside this broad-shouldered young man, but the surface was all contained energy and studied composure. He sat with his hands on the table and looked at Old Ben with the expression he deployed when he was certain he was in trouble, and had decided the best strategy was to wait for more information before reacting. Padme sat across from him. She was a senator now, had been for 3 years, since she'd left the governorship, and the role had added a layer of precision to her already considerable self-possession. She looked at Old Ben with the clear, assessing gaze of a woman who had negotiated trade disputes and blockades, and survived 2 assassination attempts, and was not, in any meaningful sense, afraid of a Jedi Knight's opinion of her personal life. Old Ben appreciated that about her. He had always appreciated that about her. "I'm not angry," he said. They looked at him. "I want to be clear about that first, before anything else, because I suspect both of you have been carrying some version of this conversation in your heads for quite some time. And the version in your heads probably begins with me being angry." He set his tea down. "I'm not." Another silence. Anakin's hands on the table were very still. "You know," Anakin said. "Not a question." "I've known for 8 months," Old Ben said. "I know what it looks like when you're not trying to show something, Anakin. You're very expressive when you're suppressing things. The suppression itself is visible." He said it without criticism, simply as a fact. Anakin absorbed this with the expression of someone recalibrating how carefully they had been managing their face. "You haven't said anything," Padme said. She was watching him with the careful attention of a woman deciding how much of this to trust. "No," Old Ben agreed. "I was waiting until there was something worth saying." He looked at them both, at these 2 people who had loved each other badly in the life he remembered, loved each other in secret and in shame and in the particular corrosive anxiety of a thing that cannot be spoken of in daylight. And he felt something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "There is now. The Jedi Code asks us to release attachment," he said. "It doesn't define attachment well, and the culture that has grown up around it has been interpreting it as a prohibition on love, which is not quite what it says, and which has produced, in my observation, people who love in secret and are therefore destroyed by it rather than sustained by it." He paused. "A love you're ashamed to name festers. It turns inward and pressurizes and becomes the exact thing the code was trying to prevent. Not because love is dangerous, but because concealment is." Padme was watching him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Something underneath it had loosened slightly. "I'm not here to forbid what I know is coming," Old Ben said. "I'm here to make sure it doesn't have to be a secret that eats you both alive." The lake moved below the terrace. A bird called once from somewhere in the hills, then was quiet. "The council," Anakin began. "I'll manage the council," Old Ben said. He said it the way he had once said "leave the council to me" on the steps of the temple, to a 9-year-old boy who had needed to hear that an adult was willing to carry something. "That is my responsibility, and I'm choosing to accept it. What I'm asking in return is that this," he gestured between them, "not become a secret, not hidden. You don't need to announce it to the Senate, but it cannot be a thing you lie about when someone asks directly." He looked at Anakin. "You understand why," he said. Anakin looked back at him. The studied composure had softened into something more unguarded, the face of someone being handed something they had stopped believing they would receive. "Because a lie you tell to protect something you love becomes the thing that destroys it," he said. "Yes," Old Ben said. Padme said, with the dryness of someone deciding to trust something by choosing to be slightly irreverent about it, "You said you'd manage the council. I want to know what that means before I agree to any of this." Old Ben almost smiled. "It means I will present the matter in terms they find philosophically coherent and professionally manageable. I have some experience arguing with the council." "Some experience," Anakin said, and something in his voice was warm. The wedding was small. Old Ben had expected that. Padme's Senate position made large events a liability, and neither of them was the kind of person who needed an audience to make a thing real. They held it at the Lake Villa on a morning when the mist was still on the water, with Padme's family in attendance, and 2 of her handmaidens, and a Naboo official to make the civil registration complete. The light came off the lake, and made everything look like something a painter would have invented. Old Ben stood before them and thought about how strange it was to be here, to be performing this function in a young man's body, standing in sunlight rather than watching from the shadows of a life that had already gone wrong. When he reached the portion that asked them each to speak their own intention, Anakin said what he said simply and directly, without flourish, the way he said everything he actually meant. Padme spoke hers with the precision of a woman who understood that words were binding things, and chose them accordingly. Afterward, Someone produced food, and the handmaidens laughed at something Anakin said, and the morning went on in the unhurried way of mornings that have nowhere particular to be. Old Ben sat at the edge of the terrace with his cafe and watched the lake. Anakin appeared beside him after a while, holding his own cup, and stood looking at the water. "Thank you," he said. Old Ben said nothing for a moment. "You would have found your way to her regardless," he said. "I only made sure the road didn't have to be underground." Anakin was quiet. Then, in another life, do you think it would have been different? Old Ben considered this with more care than the question probably knew it was asking for. "I think," he said, "that in another life you were very much loved and very much alone, and that those two things were allowed to exist at the same time for too long." He turned his cup in his hands. Not this time. The lake held the light. Somewhere inside the villa, Padme laughed at something. Clear and unguarded, the laugh of a woman in a room where she didn't need to manage anyone's perception of her. Anakin turned toward the sound the way a plant turns toward the sun, automatic and complete. Old Ben let him go. The Clone Wars lasted 3 years. That was the first divergence from the timeline Old Ben carried in his memory. In the original architecture of events, the war had been expected to grind on far longer, an attrition campaign designed to exhaust the Republic's institutional capacity to notice what was being done to it. This version ended faster because the Jedi fighting it were different, not more numerous, not better equipped, simply less compromised. Fewer decisions made from the chronic low-grade anxiety of an order that had been, without knowing it, operating under a long siege of the spirit. Anakin, now a Jedi Knight at 21, was the war's most decorated field commander by the end of the first year. This surprised no one who had watched him grow up. He fought the way he did everything, with total commitment and precise instinct, his tactical mind running several exchanges ahead of the current one. But he fought differently from the Anakin in Old Ben's memory. There was no recklessness in it, no edge of self-destruction that had once lived underneath the brilliance. This Anakin came home from campaigns. He came home to Padme, whose pregnancy was private but not hidden, a fact that the Senate's gossip networks had assembled into something approximate to the truth, without ever quite arriving at it officially. He came home to Old Ben, who debriefed him over terrible Temple Cafe and listened to the full account of every engagement without rushing the telling. He came home, and he slept, and he went back. Old Ben watched this and felt something that had no precise name, the relief of a man who has been carrying a grief so long he has forgotten it as grief and only knows it as weight, and then the weight lifts. And the absence of it is almost disorienting. The war ended in the Outer Rim, not with a single battle, with a series of coordinated strikes against separatist command infrastructure that Anakin and 3 other senior Jedi planned across 6 weeks, with a methodical thoroughness that left Dooku's network with nothing to route through. The Separatist Council, deprived of its military coordination capacity and increasingly aware that the Senate was developing both the will and the ability to negotiate directly with separatist worlds that had joined the Confederacy for economic rather than ideological reasons, began its fragmentation. The Republic did not win so much as the war became unprofitable for everyone sustaining it. Old Ben noted this as the functional outcome and considered what it meant for Palpatine. The war's compressed arc had moved too fast for the accumulation of institutional damage Palpatine had planned for. The emergency powers were real, but contained. The Senate was tired but functional. The Jedi were battle-hardened but not depleted. Palpatine had lost the war as a tool. This made him more dangerous, not less. In the specific way that a patient predator becomes more dangerous when patience has stopped working, forced to abandon the method it is most comfortable with. Discomfort produces improvisation. And improvisation from a Sith Lord of Palpatine's caliber was the thing Old Ben had been quietly, consistently dreading since the morning he woke up behind a ray shield on Naboo. The encrypted transmission arrived on a scrambled separatist channel, rerouted through 3 relay points in the Outer Rim, and lasted 4 minutes. Old Ben was not on it. He learned of its content through methods he did not need to explain to the Council, and he sat with the transcript for a long time in the quiet of his quarters. Palpatine's voice, not the Chancellor's warm, considered baritone, but Sidious, the voice that lived underneath it like a current beneath ice, was controlled throughout, almost entirely controlled. The almost was the thing he had said to Dooku across 4 minutes of encrypted transmission. Every thread I pull, Kenobi has already cut. He is not merely gifted, Tyrannus. He is impossible. The boy should have been ours years ago. The army should have been ours. The the war should have lasted. A long silence, then, the plan requires revision, significant revision. Kenobi is the axis, remove the axis, and the structure falls. Use everything. Old Ben read it twice, then set it down. The thing about being the target of a Sith Lord's direct assassination order was that it was, in a certain light, clarifying. He told Anakin over breakfast, not the full architecture, not Sidious, not the inhibitor chips, not the complete shape of the grand plan. He told him that he had developed intelligence suggesting a coordinated strike was being planned against senior Jedi leadership, that he was likely the primary target, and that he needed Anakin to be aware and to trust him when he said the threat was real. Anakin put down his cup. He looked at old Ben with the specific still attention he deployed when he was processing something he didn't like. "How long have you known this was coming?" Anakin asked. "That a strike was possible?" "Some time," old Ben said. "That this specific order had been given?" 3 days. "And you're telling me now?" "I'm telling you now because now is when you need to know." He paused. "I kept some things from you to protect you from dangers you weren't yet equipped to navigate. I'm telling you this because you are." Anakin was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need from me?" Old Ben felt the simplicity of it land somewhere in his chest. "Stay close. Don't go anywhere I don't know about. And when the strike comes, and it will come, fight next to me, not in front of me." The ambush came 11 days later, in a shipping lane over Sullust. 7 frigates and a Providence-class destroyer, dropping out of hyperspace at coordinates that required inside knowledge of their flight plan. Old Ben noted this for the subsequent conversation he intended to have with the Council about the depth of Palpatine's Senate intelligence network, filed it, and focused on the immediate problem. The battle lasted 4 hours. It was not comfortable. 2 of the clone battalions aboard the cruiser performed their function with the clean efficiency of well-trained soldiers, who had not received the order that would have turned them into something else. Old Ben noticed this, and felt, not for the first time, a complicated gratitude toward a Kaminoan who had altered a template in the rain. A handful of the older clones, the earliest batches, the ones Taun-C had not been able to reach, received a signal 17 minutes into the engagement and turned. It lasted 40 seconds. Old Ben and Anakin handled it together, with the minimum force necessary, and Old Ben spent the remaining hours of the battle carrying the specific weight of those 40 seconds. The task force retreated when its destroyer took critical damage. Old Ben stood on the bridge and watched it pull back into hyperspace, and felt Anakin beside him, steady, unbroken, processing the engagement with the quick, practical mind of a soldier who has learned to audit what happened without being consumed by it. "The clones," Anakin said. "Yes, that wasn't a malfunction." "No," Old Ben said. "It wasn't." Anakin turned to look at him. The question in his eyes was not accusatory. It was the question of someone who has just understood that the map he was given has a section left blank deliberately, and who wants to know what's in it. "When we're home," Old Ben said, "I'll tell you everything." The ambush site he chose was a dead system, 3 cooling planets, and a debris field in a corner of the galaxy that appeared in old navigational records as Desori, and in no one's active route planning. Old Ben had spent 6 months constructing the information trail that would lead Dooku there, a fabricated flight plan, routed through a source Dooku's network had been cultivating for 2 years, and trusted completely. He had identified the source 8 months prior, and spent those 8 months deciding what to do with that knowledge. He had arrived, finally, at this. Use it once, use it completely, and make the one use count. They dropped out of hyperspace in the early hours. Old Ben and Anakin and 2 companies of clones, a deliberately small force, small enough that Dooku would read it as a genuine transport complement rather than a prepared engagement, large enough to hold a perimeter if things went to ground. Old Ben stood at the bridge viewport and felt the force move through the system the way wind moves through tall grass, not communicating anything specific, just present, alive, paying attention. "They're already here," Anakin said, at his shoulder. Not a question, he had been feeling it too. 2 capital ships behind the debris field, Old Ben said. Dooku is on the smaller one. How many droids? Enough to make it look convincing. The droids aren't the point. Dooku is the point. He turned from the viewport. And the goal is not his defeat. Remember that. The goal is the door that's still open inside him. Anakin held his gaze. That's a complicated thing to hold on to in the middle of a combat. Yes, old Ben agreed. It is. They moved through the droid engagement like water finding channels, conserving, not stopping to fight what the battalions could handle. Old Ben had not fought a serious engagement in a young body for 7 years. He felt it as he moved. The muscle memory of the young Jedi he had been overlaid with the economy of the old man he had become, and the combination was strange and complete. No wasted movement, no wasted force, everything precisely enough and nothing more. Anakin, fighting beside him, was a different philosophy, explosive, decisive, each action committed to completely before the next began. Where old Ben deflected and redirected, Anakin resolved. They covered each other's angles without discussion, from the deep attunement of a decade in the same orbit. They reached the command center in 11 minutes. Dooku was waiting. He looked older than the files had suggested, or perhaps it was simply that standing in the same room as him made the age visible differently. The white hair, the precise goatee, the bearing that had never stopped being the bearing of a Jedi Master, regardless of what the decades since had made him. He held his curved lightsaber hilt loosely at his side, not yet ignited, with the confidence of a man who does not need to begin a sentence to be making an argument. "Master Kenobi," he said, "you've been rather more difficult to kill than anticipated." "I've had practice," old Ben said. "And the young Skywalker." Dooku's gaze moved to Anakin. "I've heard remarkable things." "Most of them are probably accurate," Anakin said. The lightsaber ignited, the red blade curved and precise, the extension of a fighting style refined across decades. Old Ben ignited his own. Anakin's blue followed. What came next was the most technically accomplished combat old Ben had been part of in either version of his life. Dooku was not diminished by age, he was concentrated by it. Form 2 at its absolute ceiling, every movement lapidary, the style assuming the person across from it was also a master and proceeding accordingly. Old Ben met it with Soresu, and the deep accumulated instinct of a man who had been fighting longer than his body looked, who anticipated not from reflex but from understanding. Who knew this style the way you know the grammar of a language you've been reading for 30 years? He did not try to win. He tried to last, and to listen, and to find the opening that was not a tactical opening but a different kind. Anakin pressed hard on the other side, the explosive Form V that Dooku had to redirect rather than absorb, managing two distinct problems simultaneously, and something eventually had to give. What gave was not what old Ben had predicted. Dooku stepped back, not retreating, choosing. He held the blade between them and looked at old Ben across it with an expression that had not been in any of the tactical calculations. "You know who I was," Dooku said. "I know who you are," old Ben said. He lowered his blade a fraction. "Not a surrender, an opening. Yan Dooku, Qui-Gon's master. The Jedi who loved the Order enough to grieve what it had become, and couldn't find anyone willing to stand in the grief with him." Something moved in Dooku's face. Very small. The kind of small that meant it was very large. "You didn't fall because you were weak," old Ben said. He took one step forward, slowly, unhurried. "You fell because no one caught you. Because the Order you served had built a culture that could not hold the weight of a man who was genuinely, honestly angry about genuine, honest failures. And so you fell through the floor of it into the only hands that were extended." The red blade wavered. A fraction. "Sidious's hands," old Ben said quietly. "The hands of a man who collected your grievances and called it loyalty. Who gave you a war that was never going to fix what was broken, and knew that when he gave it to you, the blade went out. It went out the way a long-held breath releases. Not dramatically, but with the specific quality of something that has been sustained past the point of sustainability and has finally found permission to stop." Dooku stood in the dark of his own command center and looked at Obi-Wan Kenobi, and old Ben looked back, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. "He is Sidious," Dooku said. His voice had changed. The educated precision was still there, but the distance underneath it, the trained, habitual remove of a man who had spent 30 years being too intelligent for his own company, was gone. What was under it was simply tired, Palpatine, the Chancellor. "Yes," old Ben said. "I know. You've known. For some time." Dooku looked at him. Something in the look was almost improbably the beginning of relief. "Why haven't you—" "Because I needed to do this first," old Ben said. "I needed you to choose it yourself, Evidence presented to the Senate by a Jedi carries political weight. Evidence confirmed by Darth Tyrannus, the leader of the separatist movement, a former Jedi Master of unimpeachable standing, who chose to come forward of his own volition. He paused. That is a different instrument entirely. Anakin had lowered his blade. He was watching Dooku with the focused, unguarded attention of someone seeing a thing they were told was impossible and recalibrating accordingly. Dooku looked at Old Ben for a long time. Then he looked at Anakin. "He trained you well," Dooku said. There was something in it, not quite an apology, not quite an absolution, but something doing the work of both. "He caught me," Anakin said simply. The debris field turned slowly outside the viewport. The engagement sounds had faded. The battalions had done their work, and the theater had gone quiet, the way theaters go quiet after everything has been resolved, except the thing that actually mattered. Old Ben reached out his hand. After a moment, Dooku took it. The Chancellor's office occupied the summit of the Senate rotunda like a crown that had decided it was the head. Old Ben had stood outside it many times in the life he remembered, waiting for audiences, delivering reports, performing the specific deference that the relationship between the Jedi Order and the Republic's executive had calcified into over centuries of mutual dependence. He had stood outside this door as a younger man and made himself slightly smaller in the way that people make themselves smaller around power they have decided is legitimate. He did not make himself smaller now. He walked through the outer office with Anakin at his left shoulder and felt the Force move through the building the way it moved through any place where something significant was about to happen. Not urgent, not alarmed, simply present and paying attention. The Senate guards at the inner door looked at them, then looked at the authorization that Leia Organa had processed through 3 committee channels in the previous 48 hours. A request for an emergency session regarding intelligence pertaining to the security of the Republic, co-signed by 11 senators and 1 former separatist leader whose testimony had been delivered to a closed council session the previous morning and had produced a silence lasting 4 full minutes before anyone spoke. The guards stepped aside. Old Ben opened the door. Palpatine was standing at the window when they entered. He was looking out at Coruscant, at the skylanes and the Senate district, and the endless, indifferent city that spread in every direction as far as the eye could reach. His hands were clasped behind his back. His posture was the posture of a man in complete command of a room he has not yet turned to face, which was a particular kind of performance Old Ben recognized and had prepared for. "Master Kenobi," Palpatine said. His voice was the Chancellor's voice, warm, considered, faintly paternal. "And Anakin, this is an unexpected visit." "Not entirely," Old Ben said. Palpatine turned. He looked at them both, that practiced, penetrating gaze that had read people accurately for 60 years, and something moved in his eyes. Not surprise. What moved in his eyes was closer to arrival, the recognition of a moment he had been anticipating and preparing for, and had not been able to prevent. "I see," Palpatine said. "Dooku sends his regards." Old Ben said. The Chancellor's expression did not change. That was the remarkable thing. Even now, even here, the composure held at the surface. It held the way ice holds when the temperature has already dropped below what's required to maintain it, through sheer structural inertia, knowing it is only a matter of time. "You have been," Palpatine said, with something that might have been appreciation in a different context, "extraordinarily difficult to manage, Obi-Wan." "I've been told," Old Ben said. "I have watched you for 7 years dismantle every element of a plan that took me 5 decades to construct." He tilted his head slightly. "I find myself curious. How much do you know?" "Everything," Old Ben said simply. The composure broke. Not dramatically. Nothing Palpatine did was dramatic in the crude sense. It broke the way a foundation cracks, invisibly, from within the surface intact for one more moment before what was underneath reasserted the truth of the situation. His eyes went flat. The warmth evacuated from his face with the completeness of a light going out, and what remained was Sidious, not a mask removed, but a different face emerging, older and colder, carrying the specific quality of something that has been patient for a very long time and has now run out of patience entirely. "Then we are past the point of pretense," Sidious said. His voice was different. The register had dropped, the warmth replaced by something that lived in the lower frequencies, the voice of a man who had stopped needing to perform anything for anyone. The force around him changed. Old Ben felt it. The dark side gathering the way storms gather, drawing inward before releasing outward, the specific compression of power that preceded something catastrophic. He had felt this once before, in a different life, and he had let it end him. He did not intend to let it end him again. "Anakin," old Ben said quietly. "Ready," Anakin said. Sidious moved. The lightning came from both hands simultaneously. Not an exploratory probe, but the full commitment of a man who had decided that the only remaining tool was overwhelming force. Delivered without reservation. Blue-white and absolute, crossing the distance between them in less than a second. The kind of power that ended things. Old Ben caught it. He had spent his 20 years of Tatooine silence doing more than watching desert wrens and mourning what was lost. He had read ancient Jedi texts he had carried into exile, theoretical frameworks for force projection that the Order had largely set aside in favor of combat technique, meditations on the relationship between light-side clarity and kinetic resistance that he had worked through line by line across countless cold dawns. The ability he had developed from those foundations was not a weapon. It was not elegant. It was simply the product of a man who had an enormous amount of time and an equally enormous reason to solve a specific problem. He extended it now, the force outward in a barrier that 20 years of morning practice had made as instinctive as breathing, and he felt the lightning hit it and spread across it the way water spreads across glass. Contained, redirected, diverted into the floor and the walls and the air around them without reaching anything it had been aimed at. The effort was considerable. He held it. Sidious pressed harder. More power, deeper reserves, the dark side answering the call of decades of cultivation, of suffering chosen and multiplied and refined into fuel. Old Ben felt the barrier flex, not break, but acknowledge the weight pressing against it. He planted his feet and breathed, and held the shape of what he had built with the specific, stubborn endurance of a man who has learned, through long practice, that duration is its own form of power. Anakin moved. He moved the way he moved in combat, completely, without reservation, every system committed. He came around the left side of the barrier where the lightning was not, closing distance before Sidious could redirect. And when Sidious turned to meet him, the lightning split its attention between two targets and halved its effectiveness against both. Sidious was extraordinary. The technical mastery of a Sith Lord who had spent 60 years in uncontested practice, the strategic mind that had run the entire galaxy's political architecture through sheer patience and precision, the raw power of someone who had chosen the dark side's accelerant and used it without restraint for half a century. He was all of these things. He was fighting a man who could not be broken and a young knight who had nothing to fear. That combination had no counter in his playbook. Anakin got inside his guard. The strike was precise and decisive and measured, not a killing blow, not from anger, not from fear. The blow of a Jedi Knight who understood exactly what he was doing and why, delivered with the clarity of someone who had been told the truth about this man from the beginning, and had therefore never built anything on the relationship that needed to be unmade before acting. Sidious went down, not dead, contained, incapacitated, the force around him disrupted in a way that would hold long enough for the Senate guards stationed in the outer office per Bail Organa's arrangement, long enough for the recording that had been running since the moment they walked through the door to have captured everything that needed capturing. The office was very quiet. Old Ben lowered his barrier and breathed through the effort of having held it, and looked at the man on the floor, at Palpatine, at Sidious, at the person who had spent 50 years building the architecture that would have burned a galaxy, and felt something that was not triumph, relief, perhaps, the specific, exhausted relief of a weight set down after a very long carry. Anakin stood over Sidious and looked at old Ben across the space between them. "Is it over?" Anakin asked. Old Ben looked at his student, at this young man who had grown up known and caught and loved, who had fought this battle from a foundation that could hold the weight of it, who was standing in the Chancellor's office having just helped end the longest shadow in the galaxy's recent history, and who was going to go home tonight to a wife and in a few months to children. "It's over," old Ben said. Years pass the way water moves, without announcement, without asking permission, wearing the ground into new shapes so gradually that the change is only visible from a distance. Coruscant reformed itself slowly, the way things reform when the pressure that was deforming them is removed. The Senate took 3 years to sort itself out, which old Ben considered remarkably efficient, given what it had been working with. Bail Organa's patient, principled hand in that process was something old Ben noted with quiet gratitude, and never said enough aloud. The Jedi Order survived, diminished by the war, changed by the reckoning that followed the revelation of how thoroughly it had been compromised without knowing it, but present, working, and in the specific argument it now had with itself about doctrine and practice, and the question of what the code actually meant versus what it had become, more alive than it had been in decades. Yoda retired from the Council at 906, citing, with his characteristic precision, that he had things to think about that required quiet. Old Ben visited him once a year on a small green moon the old master had chosen for reasons he did not fully explain. They sat together and talked and watched the light change, and disagreed about several things productively. Anakin became a master before he turned 25. The council vote was unanimous, which had not happened in over a decade. Old Ben was 53 the afternoon he sat on the grass outside the Skywalker house, on the outskirts of a quiet city on Alderaan, and watched Luke run. The boy was 4 years old and running with the specific, joyful purposelessness of a child who has not yet learned that movement should have destinations. Leia sat in the grass, 20 feet away, constructing something architectural out of sticks with the focused, serious intensity of a person who would, one day, run a Senate, and did not look up when her brother ran past her, because she had already assessed the trajectory and determined it did not require her attention. Shmi sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched her grandchildren with the expression of someone who has received something they did not permit themselves to expect, and has not yet stopped being surprised by it. Anakin came and sat beside old Ben on the grass, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and looked at his children the way he looked at everything he loved, completely, without reservation, with none of the anxious scanning for threats that had characterized the version of this man that old Ben had failed the first time around. "Grandpa Ben," Anakin said, not to old Ben, to Luke, who had reversed course and was now running toward them with his arms out. Old Ben caught the boy when he arrived, 4 years old and solid and warm, smelling of grass and something sweet, and held him, and felt the force around this child the way he had once felt it around his father. Enormous, unhurried, patiently waiting to become whatever it was going to become. Again, Luke said, which was his current solution to every situation. In a moment, old Ben said. Luke accepted this and sat in his lap and looked at the sky with the uncomplicated attention of someone who finds the sky genuinely interesting, which old Ben had always thought was one of the better ways to approach it. The afternoon light moved across the grass. Leia completed her construction, examined it, and began dismantling it to build something more ambitious. Anakin leaned back on his hands and was quiet for a moment. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked, not specifying he did not need to. Old Ben considered the question with the full weight it deserved. He thought about a corridor bathed in orange light at the edge of something immense. He thought about a ray shield on Naboo, and a young man's body and the smell of ozone, and the specific grief of a second chance. He thought about every small, daily choice across 23 years, the choice to kneel, the choice to stay, the choice to speak, the choice to trust, and how none of them had been large on the day they were made, and how the accumulation of them had become, without announcement, everything. Sometimes, he said, Luke had fallen asleep in his lap with the instantaneous completeness that only the very young manage, his weight warm and absolute, and entirely trusting. Old Ben looked at him, then at Leia, still building, then at the afternoon light on the grass of Alderaan, which was green and unhurried and entirely, perfectly ordinary. The galaxy had been saved not by the suppression of love, not by the perfection of detachment, not by the code applied with sufficient rigidity. It had been saved by a man who had learned, across 2 lives and more grief than anyone should have, to simply tell the truth about what he felt, and by the extraordinary young man that truth had helped become possible. Old Ben closed his eyes. He breathed. The force moved through everything around him, through the grass and the children and the afternoon light and the sleeping boy in his lap, the way it had always moved, patient and vast and entirely unconcerned with the smallness of any given moment, because it understood, as it had always understood, that the small moments were where everything actually happened. It was enough. It was, in every sense that mattered, more than enough. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.